Now, people don't know this. Well, a lot of people do, but some people don't. And of course, when Luther was going to school, he studied at Erfurt, and he studied, of course, with logicians out of the Bielfeldt school, which would be called an Aquinas school. And so Luther really knew how to think very clearly because he had studied to do this. And in those days, to be a doctor of theology, one had to be a master of philosophy first. You couldn't go after your doctorate until you had a master's. And the master's level instruction was instruction in rhetoric, and grammar, and logic, and semantics, and all of those things. Now I want to have you turn your attention to this slide called semantic ambiguity. And of course, I think that semantic ambiguity happens all the time in philosophy, and so do philosophers. And so much of the 20th century dealt with trying to clarify philosophical assertions to see what is actually being meant by language such as there is a mind. What does that actually mean? But if it's true of philosophy that it's sometimes problematic to know exactly what is meant, this is even more fundamentally the case in theology. But the problem with theology is that theologians oftentimes don't sit around reflecting upon the semantic issues. They sometimes somehow think that if the words are said, then something is communicated by these words. So if two people say the same words, they agree to some extent, even though they might mean actually different things. For instance, I want you to take a look at the expression, Christ grants eternal life. Now, I can imagine a whole class of Christians who might try to unpack the phrase Christ grants eternal life by saying something of this kind. Well, Christ grants eternal life means that there is a person having agency. Well, a person does have agency. There is an agent, I probably should have said, possessing the nature of God, that is, having a divine nature. There is an agent having a divine nature that grants to human beings an everlasting extension in the field of time. That could certainly be the meaning of Christ grants eternal life. But if you are a person who has taken the Kantian turn, that is to say that you know that language about God is not language about a substance having causal relations with other things in the universe. And if you want to know more about this, keep watching these lectures, right? If you want to know more about that. If you look at the question or the phrase Christ grants eternal life as a person who believes that the language doesn't really refer to some state of affairs outside me, some divine realm over and against me, you might give it the following type of interpretation, that the phrase really means that there is a real symbol, you're thinking Ron or Tillich here, right, that participates in the power of being itself, that grants an existential empowerment constituted by a transtemporal unity of disrupted moments in time. That, by the way, is Tillich's definition of eternal life, to men and women in the face of the fundamental anxieties of human existence. So, I mean, we just have to be aware of the fact that, the guy up in the pulpit might be saying, Christ grants eternal life, and he might mean something like, well, there is a real symbol that participates in the power of being itself, that grants an existential empowerment constituted by a temporal unity of disruptive moments in time, blah, 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 blah. And the guy out in the pew who's giving money for the preacher to teach might think the first thing. And this is an interesting thing that we find in theology, that it seems like it becomes very important to hold on to the same language even when meanings change. What is meant? Truth is not defined as a correspondence between words and state of affairs, normally in philosophy, but between what is meant by the words and by the states of affairs. When I teach an introductory course in logic and semantics, I try to show the students, of course, that the first thing we have to do with the sentence is find out what proposition is meant by the sentence, right? So we have to give the sentence an interpretation. And only after we give it an interpretation can we know if the bloody thing is true or false, right? So in philosophy, we always try to understand the proposition meant by a particular concatenation of words. A string of words means something. We've got to know what it's meant before we can say if it's true or false. But oftentimes in theology, it seems that the meaning is not as important as just the ability to say the words. Now, I'm hoping you're understanding by this that I'm talking about now merely another example of why the study of philosophy is important in theology, because if I didn't have any sort of study of philosophy in my background, I wouldn't say this about theology, right? I wouldn't even know this. So agreement in theology, I wouldn't know that it's kind of a problem when we say we have agreement when two sides on an issue can affirm the same words. I would think, well, maybe we have some agreement there. But as a philosopher, I know we don't have an agreement until we have a canonical interpretation of those words that both agree to. So, truth is a matter of interpretation and meaning. Truth and meaning are connected. It's not syntax in truth. You can't get there just from the fact that words are said. You can't get to the truth or falsity. You have to have the words said, the thing meant by the terms, and then by the assertions of what is meant by the terms. In particular ways, you will say that this is either true or false. Now, over there on the right, you'll see called to common mission. This was a very famous document that was put together by the ELCA with the Episcopal Church USA. Some of you might not even remember that this was important, but at one point it was very important to people to say that we are in agreement with the Episcopalians, so we put together a document such that Lutherans could read it in one way and Episcopalians could read it in another way, and they both could agree. Of course, they both agreed because they read it in different ways, which, if you're a philosopher, means there's no agreement at all, right? I mean, sometimes we just have to be clear. I mean, philosophy is something that God has given us. It's part of the created order. But Luther said that, reason is the highest gift of God. So sometimes we have to use these things to help us understand theology, theological propositions. We have to understand the nature of our assertions. Philosophy doesn't get us to heaven, of course not, but it can be quite helpful in understanding what it would mean for something to get us to heaven. Okay, philosophy deals, of course, it is, in the ancient world, it was the wisdom of the world. Philosophy used human reason, perception, and it gave us a disciplined set of responses. It gave us a disciplined method of proceeding and a coherent set of answers to fundamental questions of the world. Now, we oftentimes say something like that the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. Well, of course, in that statement, it's a scandal of the cross, the foolishness of the cross that subverts the wisdom of the world. We have to probably understand what the wisdom of the world is first, and how noble it is, and how not self-interested it is, in order for us to understand how theology subverts the wisdom of the world. Now let me give you a case in point here. I mean, if theology is subverting the best in us, then the subversion of theology, its subversion of philosophy, has to go beyond the best in us. So if I'm seeing theology that seems to be just a theology of self-interest, and I realize that in philosophy, in order to try to find truth, we go beyond self-interest, well, if theology is above philosophy, in some sense, I'm not expecting it to be below philosophy and just be another sort of coded language for political self-interest, which is what some people believe. So, in order for us to know what is even meant by the foolishness of the cross, we better know a little bit of what is meant by the wisdom of the world. What truths do we find by steering by our own best lights? Finally, this is my final point in the lecture. You know, you just can't understand very much theology without understanding philosophy. Now, I was in a graduate program in philosophy and theology. I did my PhD in theology, philosophical theology. I did my PhD, but I wouldn't have been able to understand a lot of the tradition that I was reading if I hadn't had the philosophical background that I had. And just basically, I couldn't understand these students sitting next to me who hadn't studied deep philosophical issues, and they're just sitting there skimming through Thomas Aquinas. I could never get it. Man, I have to struggle to get through Aquinas to figure out if all these arguments are really working. And they just sort of sit and kind of turn the pages. Well, it occurred to me after a while that they didn't understand what was on the pages, and I think that it's probably true that if you have a bunch of students reading in the history of theology, they're going to miss much of what the theologians are saying unless they know something about Plato, right? Or, depending upon the time, Aristotle. Plato, of course, lived from 429 to 347. His Academy of Athens persisted. He founded it. It persisted for at least about 300 years, down to around 80 BC, 83 BC. Then another academy grew, but there was still a tradition between those. Plato's philosophy has tremendous impact on the development of theology. And Neoplatonic philosophy, this is new thinking in the Platonic vein, right, is just very important for understanding Augustine, but even understanding the development of the notion of the Trinity. If the Trinity always seems a little odd to you, and you wonder how can three be one, well, then you should go back and you should read some of the philosophers in the school of the academy, because you'll see guys there who are thinking in some ways that are not dissimilar to this, and you're going to say, oh my goodness, this Trinity that was formulated, these ideas were in the air philosophically in the intelligentsia of the time. So if you want to understand theology from about the middle of the 13th century on, you better understand Aristotle. Aristotle was rediscovered in the West, first made use of by Albertus Magnus, and of course Thomas Aquinas. There was a strong Aristotelian tradition. The Lutherans loved Aristotle. Luther not so much. He said Aristotle was darkness, but actually he still thought in Aristotelian ways in many respects. And this is, of course, very nicely documented in this new book by Dieter over in Germany. But certainly in the development of Lutheran dogmatic theology, you basically have to know some Aristotle to be able to work through these texts of the early 16th century, very late 16th century, and then 17th century and early 18th century texts. I would say that the very conceptuality of theology until the Enlightenment presupposes the philosophical conceptuality of antiquity. And I would say that most theology after the Enlightenment presupposes much of the philosophical work done during the time of the Enlightenment. In the medieval period, philosophical study was considered to be necessary for the study of theology, and as I mentioned before, in order to get one's doctorate in theology, one first had to have a master's in philosophy. Philosophical knowledge was presupposed by the great classical theologians. To read theology without knowing philosophy is like trying to read a mathematician without knowing what the symbols mean, right? I mean, it's kind of nice to read what Cantor says about a set theory when you're reading Cantor, but it's kind of like you kind of like to know what the symbols mean too. If you're trying to read mathematics and you don't know what the symbols mean, you're kind of always in the dark. And I think that's what's happened in much of our theological education today. We assign these great thinkers, theological thinkers, but we don't give our students enough philosophy for them to know what they're even, presupposing, what the very questions are that are animating the discourse, and why they come out here rather than there. Theology, I say, will always presuppose some philosophy, and that's so even today, even with our most postmodern and cutting-edge contemporary theologies. There is a philosophical presupposition hidden, generally way more than one of them. And to come to terms with this is very important for understanding exactly everything that's going on in the theology. Now, the Institute of Lutheran Theology understands that philosophical examination is very important, and that philosophy is always in conversation with theology. And we say on our website that we are committed to theological realism. That means that we believe that there are actual divine states of affairs. That we are committed to semantic realism, and that means that we actually believe that theological language is about something, and that it's true and false on the basis of what obtains, in some sense. And finally, we are committed to the notion that there is, in principle, some causal connection between the divine and that which is not divine. And of course, many would reject that, but we would hold that it's very difficult to make sense out of notions like creates and redeems by stripping them. If you strip them of any causal connotation, and a causal connotation would be produce, right, or brings about. If you strip any causal connotation out of creates and redeems, it's not clear what you're left with. And the fact that theologians have been able to do this so effectively may be less due to their brilliance and ingeniousness, and maybe more from the fact that the people that read them haven't read them critically enough.